Hi you guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we have the messed up origins of Banshees. Now this is something I am actually particularly interested in and wanted to look into because a couple months ago I actually had a dream of a banshee. Let my mom tell it. Very weird, very creepy. I don't like it at all. If you want to know the story on that, you guys can let me know. I can tell it on the story time or whatever on Friday on our Let's Talk sessions. But yeah, I didn't even know that's what it was. When I talked to my mom about it or whatever, she's the one who told me that that's what that was, that I saw in my dream or whatever. That yeah, like I said, I don't like it. I actually have another topic that I want to talk to you guys about eventually, which is how I have dreams, and this has been a thing since I was a child. I've had dreams of things that will actually manifest in real life. So sometimes for me, having dreams, I'm not particularly fond of. I don't like it because I know that it has the possibility of, actually manifesting. But like I said, that's a topic that I'll eventually talk to you guys about on a Friday, one of these days or something. But let's go ahead and hop right into the video because like I said, I am very interested to hear the origins about this. What is this? Why is this a thing? It's creepy. I don't like it. It's scary. So I need to know. So we're gonna find out together.
So contrary to the commonly held belief of the modern day, banshees are not some kind of she-demon who drag their victims to early graves. Believe it or not, despite commonly being referred to as spirits or ghosts nowadays, traditionally they were categorized as fairies, and their name originally meant fairy woman, though they were still heavily associated with death. According to tradition, banshees were female fairies that foretold the death of a family member, or in some instances delivered the news that a family member had just died by wailing, crying, or shrieking, and only those related to the deceased could hear them. Now to clarify, she doesn't kill said family member, nor does hearing her cry mean that you are going to die next. She's basically a mythical messenger who doesn't want you to have to wait for the obituaries to come out to know that your great aunt Tessie died. But not everyone in Ireland was so lucky to get a heads up about their relative's death. You had to be able to trace your lineage back to the Milesians, the oldest ancestors of the present-day Irish, which means banshees only looked out for those whose last name started with O or Micmac, with a few exceptions. And while they're mostly auditory creatures, throughout the centuries there's been a number of different descriptions of what banshees actually look like. In Catherine Briggs's 1976 Encyclopedia of Fairies, she claims it has long streaming hair, wears a gray cloak over a green dress, and her eyes are red from continual weeping. Right, I'm sure that's what it's from. Weeping. With a P. Back in the 1600s, English writer Anne Franshaw claimed to see a banshee firsthand and said it was dressed in white with red hair and a ghastly complexion, while other accounts describe something a bit more ominous. A shrouded woman crouched beneath the trees, lamenting with a veiled face. There's also been some disagreement over the size of the banshee, with descriptions varying depending on which region of Ireland you ask in. Some claim she's unnaturally tall like Slender Man, but the majority of tales describe her as being between 1 and 4 feet high. Some experts believe this short stature could be a reflection of her old age, even though she can appear as an old or young woman, but others theorize it's to emphasize her status as a fairy. Then again, depending on who you ask, the banshee might not be a fairy at all. Starting in the late 1800s, she began to take a much more ghostly, dare I say spoopy form, with the stories about her sounding a lot more, for lack of a better term, generic. Now I don't want it to come across like I'm hating on the culture, far from it, but that's honestly how it comes off to me. In my opinion, her being a fairy is a lot more enigmatic and interesting. It's like fairies are magical creatures and you can never tell what they're capable of. Meanwhile, ghosts are just predictable. And before you get mad, let me explain. Those who believe banshees are the spirits of the dead typically say they come in 2 different forms depending on who they were in life. When a young and innocent member of the family passed away, whether it be from illness, violence, or tragedy, she'd return as a banshee, and if she liked her family, she would come back in the form of a beautiful young spirit who, instead of wailing her warning, would sing it. However, if the banshee in question hated her family in life, she'd return as an old, disfigured apparition that would howl her warnings with a tone of excitement statement that someone she despised was going to die soon. And while I certainly find these distinctions to be pretty cool, they just sound like exactly what I'd expect. I mean, how many famous ghost stories do you know with nearly identical setups? Granted, I can't really fault this interpretation with being unoriginal when it started to surface over 120 years ago at least. I just prefer the fairy explanation because to me, it's so much more unique. For those who don't know, the modern-day fairies of Ireland were once believed to be gods known as Tuatha De Danann that went and disappeared underground after the arrival of the Milesians, and over the centuries, the public's imagination evolved the gods into fairies. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that banshees were gods at one point, but they existed on the same mythical level, similar to the sea nymphs or muses in Greek mythology. That being said, it doesn't sound like they made nearly as good a music. So now that you've got the scoop on what banshees are, let's talk a little bit about their history, because it's pretty damn interesting. Unfortunately, it's impossible to say exactly how long people have believed in them, but the earliest written mention of banshees can be traced back to the publication of Sean McCraith's Triumphs of Torlau back in 1380. The book depicts the wars between the Irish O'Brien family and the English De Clares for the Thomond region of Ireland, and for some reason, O'Brien is spelled like this. You wonder why I'm starting slow and steady with our Celtic series? Names like that are exactly why. Anyway, there are 3 specific banshees described in the text. One of them is beautiful, which rarely fits descriptions of banshees in later centuries, and the other 2 are ugly as fuck. The ugly ones are also said to be surrounded by mutilated bodies and worn armies that are marching towards battle and their doom, but the commanders pretty much always ignore them and journey on toward their own destruction. Mentions of the fairies can also be found in Norman literature from that time, the Normans being the people who were born from Norse Viking settlers coming into contact with the French. Outside of these 2 sources, though, they aren't written about again until around 300 years later in the Memoirs of Lady Franshawe that we mentioned earlier. That was transcribed sometime in the late 1600s. Now, it's definitely possible they were written about prior to that and the texts were just lost or destroyed over time, but like the majority of folklore, we can assume this legend was mostly passed on through the art of oral storytelling. But even still, you've got to wonder where the idea of banshees comes from, right? I mean, a fairy that wails to warn you about the death of a family member is a pretty specific concept. While experts believe it may have been inspired by a pretty specific tradition that took place during Irish, Scottish, and Welsh funerals. That tradition was known as keening. It entailed a woman who would sing sad songs, cry, and wail very loudly over the deceased's body, essentially channeling the sadness of the entire community through her vocals for days on end. It might sound weird, but for a long time it was the standard way for the dead person's family and loved ones to release grief. I don't know if it was something about seeing a person act out what you're feeling deep down, or maybe it just helped you feel like you weren't alone in your misery, but there was something oddly therapeutic about having a keener there, and the best ones even received payment for their services. Unfortunately, the practice was completely phased out before the 1960s by the Catholic Church, who considered it a little too pagan for their liking, but we have managed to preserve some recordings of one of the last living professional keeners from back in the day named Bridget Mullen.
Oh, no.
You can really hear the loss in her voice, can't ya? Now, to those wondering how exactly all this connects with banshees, the belief back then was that the better the keener was, the more important the person being mourned. So when the most important people died, like the aristocrats and royal family members, they had the best keeners at their funeral. In fact, they were so good, the common folk thought them to be fairy women and referred to them as banshees, which slowly morphed into banshees. But John, didn't you say earlier that banshees were usually decrepit, scary-looking old women? If keeners were highly sought-after professionals, how did the reputation get mingled with these ominous heralds of death? Well, I'm sad to say that most keeners lived pretty depressing lives, and while gifted in their craft, many of them were paid in alcohol, which led to them becoming alcoholic old women who were banished from their villages or forced to live on the outskirts of town. And what do you do when you're a depressed, alcoholic exile whose only skill is singing sad songs? You sing them. Even if it's the middle of the night and the only person who hears you mistakes you for a mythical creature whose song is so sad it must be a sign of terrible things to come. And if you're not sold on this theory just yet, those 2 other countries where keening was a common practice have their own versions of the banshee. In Scottish folklore, there's a similar creature known as the
I thought he was going to play another soundtrack. The way I was going to... Y'all, the way I was about to throw these headphones off,
A washerwoman who's said to be seen washing the blood-stained clothes or armor of those who are about to die. And in Welsh folklore, they have the Caha Wraith, which doesn't have a physical form, but is rather a disembodied voice that wails and moans to signal a person's death. Man, if you don't even have to look the part, it would be really easy to prank someone in Wales if they knew about the Caha Wraith. But I know you guys are way too nice to do anything like that, right? Anyway, that, Solo fam, was the messed up origins of Banshees. If you don't know, now you know.
that did not make me feel any better about my dream. I'm just going to be honest. Yeah, nobody that I know though, or you know, at least as far as like my mom haven't told me anybody has passed, which is good. So I'm just going to ignore it. Like, but if you guys made it to the end of this video, of course, thank you guys so much for watching. And of course, for specific uploads, you guys just check that in the description box below. Bye.